Are filter bubbles going to get worse with agents? Because I kind of think they are,
Oh,
because
yeah.
you'll be able to make your own reality.
This is filter bubbles on steroids, right, that we're headed into.
Hello, welcome to The Most Interesting Thing in AI from Rethink, the Atlantic's creative marketing studio, in collaboration with PwC, a leader in helping organizations use AI. Eli Pariser is one of the smartest people I've ever talked to about digital spaces. We've been talking for a long time. I feel like every time I learn something from him. He coined the term the filter bubble. He's one of the first people I ever heard make smart structural critiques about social media and the social media companies. When I tried to create a social media company that was the reverse of all the ones that existed, he had the kind of best, most creative ideas. He used to run MoveOn.org. He later co-founded Upworthy. Today, he runs a nonprofit called New Public, where he's developing a social networking tool called Roundabout. Ideally, it will connect local communities while helping users avoid filter bubbles. Eli also has a lot of thoughts about AI agents and how they'll change the way that social media, digital town squares work. I wanted to learn where he thinks AI can help, where it will cause harm. So here's my conversation with Eli Pariser. Eli Pariser, welcome to The Most Interesting Thing in AI.
Thanks for having me on.
I am delighted to have you here to talk about how we're going to communicate in the age of AI. So let me start with, you had a little trip recently to the Vatican, and you made an argument that AI could help with the digital town square, with this communications that you've spent your life working, building, improving. And you made an argument to the Pope. You said, we don't have to relive the worst disasters of social media. We have a window to get things right this time. So what does that mean?
Looking back at 15 years of working on social media and trying to call out how I thought it was going to not be a great thing for our society and watching how those arguments unfolded, I came to the conclusion that so much in these companies is kind of baked into the economic model. And if you're selling advertising and you're a publicly traded company, that there's just limited range of motion that you have to make decisions that prioritize users or the public over the next quarterly profit report. And this was something that I heard over and over again from product manager. Like, it's one thing to sort of theorize that, it's another thing to hear people say, like, yeah, we had that feature on the product roadmap and it just kept getting pushed back quarter by quarter because we had to launch other stuff. So to me, that's the story of social media is kind of we've seen how it works when we put a huge amount of the way that we communicate inside companies that are built to optimize for eyeballs and engagement, and it's not so good. And now here we are at the beginning of the AI era, and we have a company that's sort of curious about that strategy, OpenAI. We have Anthropic, which is so far on a different kind of path. And there's just huge open questions about what the economics of this era are going to be. Like, we're very, very early.
So there are two problems that you mentioned. One is selling advertising, the other is public companies. These are, in fact, going to be public companies very shortly,
Yeah, yeah.
so don't worry about that one. So do you think the social media era would have been fundamentally different if the big platforms, Meta, then Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, had chosen subscription models instead of ad-based models?
I really do. I mean, I think, and again, it's one thing to sort of speculate, but when you talk to the people who are building these things and you hear what the incentive structures were for them inside the companies, this is the thing that you hear is just like, at the end of the day, Facebook in particular, Meta, is a very metric driven company. Everybody's watching the metrics, everybody's financially incentivized around the metrics, and the metrics were not well-being metrics. The metrics were grow users, grow engagement. And so I do think that that's fundamentally different from a platform that's focused on other kinds of models.
All right, so we now have this reset moment where we're going to recreate the digital town square, and we're all going to communicate with each other in different ways, and AI is going to be in the middle in some way or the other. You think that there's a chance to set the incentives in a different way that leads to a very healthy town square in the way that didn't exist in the last era. I want to break all of this apart, but why don't you start by explaining what will the digital town square of the future with AI in the middle even look like? Why won't it just be like Twitter with a bunch of AI bots confusing you?
I think we'll see some of that in the as we make this transition. But I guess we start at New Public with this idea of kind of the agentic interface, and the agentic interface is the truly personalized, agent-driven daily briefing, daily information stream that's pulled together for you from a whole bunch of different sources and platforms and information streams. And so you've got this agent that is anticipating, what do we need to know about the meeting later? What do we need to know about your kid's school? And what do we need to know about what's going on in the world? Pulling that all into one format that might be different for you than it is for me, might be a podcast for you, might be a written thing for me. And that's the way that we're starting to understand what's going on. And so I think it's useful to think about the differences between the way that social media has worked and this era that we're moving into. We've lived in this world of a single, algorithm in the center. Everybody uses Facebook and everybody sees some personalization, but it's all driven through one algorithmic logic. And I think we're going to start to see even greater fragmentation, even greater pulling apart as we move into this agentic world.
The old way it worked is you went onto Twitter and you communicated with other people. So there's a town square in those interactions, or you went onto Blue Sky. I think you're there more now than you are on Twitter. But in any case, there used to be interactions with other humans as you gather this information. So where is the town square?
So we did this analysis of where do we think this kind of agentic interface is going to displace a lot of the uses that people use social media for right now, and where do we think actually people will continue to communicate with human beings? And our hypothesis is that a lot of the things that people use social media for right now will get displaced. The town squareness is going to erode when it comes to things like learning about products or learning about tutorials. A lot of these kind of like information needs that social media meets are going to get eroded for several reasons.
I've always thought of the town square as the place where we go and we debate ideas or news. But one of your insights is that town square is actually where we find the local plumber and get help on, learning Python, right? And so actually the good parts of the town square where we learn about Python and call the plumber are going to be replaced by agents, right? And the bad parts of the town square where we yell at each other about the war in Iran, those are going to still be human to human interactions,
Well,
right?
the problem I've always had with this town square metaphor when it comes to the internet is that we've used it to describe these sort of like global algorithmic systems that are not really town squarey in any sense. Like the metaphor totally breaks down, right? Because a town square is a spatially limited place where a particular group of people get together, often built around economic exchange first, like town squares were marketplaces.
Yeah.
And then people started adding soapboxes, and they were never like primarily places designed for political exchange, right? But it served a bunch of purposes for people in a community, and then it became a place where people also talked about the big things that affected
That's
everyone.
interesting, right? You set up the town square and you sell your cucumbers and kale, and
Right.
then somebody also sets up a soapbox, and then somebody also wants you to sign their petition for this or that, and it becomes a multi-use area.
But so that's not what Twitter ever was. And I have some nostalgia for Twitter in its heyday, but it's not
It's what Nextdoor tried to be, but then Nextdoor was just like, hey, there's a crime, be scared.
Well, and fascinatingly, Nextdoor actually was doing it sort of more in that way. And then they made this shift as they ran up to their IPO, where they decided to, instead of prioritizing the stuff closest to you, prioritize the most engaging posts
Right.
anywhere in your rough vicinity, which is why I get in Fort Greene, posts from Washington Heights about some stabbing that isn't part of my local neighborhood here in New York.
Right. And what
But
you
that
really
was
want to know is what the hours on the farmer's market at Fort Greene Park are, but that's not as engaging and it's not going to, increase your emotions.
exactly.
That's super interesting. Okay.
And that's and by the way, like I've talked to the Nextdoor product people who made those decisions.
Yeah.
They knew that this was going to have consequences in terms of the social fabric of the place that they were building, but they had to show some up and to the right, charts to their potential IPO, investors.
Where are agents going to interrupt the town square, and where are they not?
In these places where we're more consuming information, trying to make buying decisions, these kinds of places, I think we're going to see a lot of disruption, and that's both going to be because, on the one hand, there's going to be a lot of creation of AI generated content, AI generated personalities. I guess I look at the influencer ecosystem and don't see how a lot of that ecosystem gets displaced by like influencers that are not real. Like I think the idea that you can only have a parasocial relationship with a real human is probably like a thing we'll look back at and think was cute.
And most people, they're like, what job is going to be displaced first? And the answer is like, I don't know, paralegals, coders, truck drivers. And you're like, influencers.
Well, I mean, if you can post 1,000 times a day and optimize each post and be super charming and all the best way, I think there are a lot of niches to fill that people will find ways
I'm
to.
terrified of the more handsome Nick Thompson doing the most interesting thing in AI every day, on LinkedIn.
There's no more hams. So on the one hand, I think you have these bigger, sort of more utilitarian spaces getting disrupted.
Right.
On the other hand, you know, I do not want my friend's agent replying to me in the group chat, right?
Right.
Like that fundamentally disrupts the need that I have, which is to communicate with my friend and to be in connection with my friend. And the same thing is true, I think, for some, local community needs. When I want to communicate with my neighbor, I want to communicate actually with my neighbor, the person, so that when I run into them on the street later, I don't say, "Oh, that was a nice text you sent me," and they say, like, "I don't know what you're talking about." Like, there's something about when it's a known person with whom you're going to have a relationship over time that's fundamentally different in terms of the kind of connection
Is that what
needs.
you want to happen, or is that what you think is going to happen? I mean, do you think that group chats, right? So we're in like lots of WhatsApp groups and we're communicating about all kinds of stuff. You think those will end up being agent free, whereas the big platforms, Reddit, Twitter, Meta, will become full of agents, simulated humans, and whatnot?
I think there will be a high social cost to displacing yourself with an agent in those circumstances. I think there will be other ways that people use agents in like these smaller contexts, like having an agent that helps facilitate a conversation or bring in valuable, I'm in a local neighborhood chat, and, the number of times people ask the same question over again, you could have an agent on the side going like, hey, here's the thread
Yeah.
where we already talked about this. That's a much more controlled setting and there's more trust. And so what we're looking at is a situation where real humans go to smaller, more trust oriented spaces. And then, the kind of open, social, large algorithmic spaces get pretty AIified pretty quickly. What's interesting about the messaging context is that messaging is already kind of almost a commodity. Like it's not, I don't know about you, but I guess I find it almost immaterial if I'm chatting with people on iMessage or WhatsApp or Signal.
Right.
And so I think the interesting opportunity here, as we move into this world where it's also possible to kind of vibe code any platform that you want, is kind of this world where group chats become their own kind of micro platforms.
Oh.
And, we both like running. You like running a lot more than I do, even. And the idea of being able to take your running group chat and add some really cool features that allow people to coordinate better, allow people to, maybe there's a leaderboard or other kinds of ways that people are connecting, and just kind of add those features as you need them as a community. There's something really
So
cool
you
there.
think the future? So that's not WhatsApp. I said the future is on WhatsApp. You actually that would specifically not be WhatsApp because WhatsApp is
Correct.
not going to let you add features. It will be either some open source base messaging platform, or maybe it will be something else. Maybe you and I will be like, you know what? It's so easy to make a messaging platform. I'm going to make a new messaging platform for this running group chat that you and I are both in.
Right.
But you think that's a future?
Well, I think that's possible, and I think that there's two things that make it more possible. One is I look at these agentic interfaces and I see them as kind of like friction eliminators a little
Yeah.
bit. So much of the web that we're used to from the 2010s really like just used friction as the way to stop people from doing complicated things.
Right.
So, was it possible for me to single-handedly click on every person on Twitter that followed me and port them over to Blue Sky? Sure, but like, did I want to do that? Was I going to do that? No. But is it possible for me to write a quick Claude code thing that helps me do that seamlessly? Yeah, that's really easy. So that's one piece, is just like those moats are easier to hop than they were. And then at the same time, I think we're going to start to see real adoption of these more open social protocols.
Yep.
And the reason is that the biggest impediment to the open social protocols is friction again. So why am I not posting to, Blue Sky and Twitter? I'm not doing that because I just don't want to open several different windows.
Yep.
But when that's trivially easy, I'm much more game to do it.
Eli, I remember you saying once before that, like Gramsci, you were a optimist of the will, pessimist by intellect. Is that correct?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so explain why that leads you to the position you're in right now about this future social. Because most people who are critics of old social media, as you've been, though you've also tried to construct better social media, and we'll get to that. Most people who are critics of old social media are pretty pessimistic right now.
Look, I think there's nothing deterministic about how this is all going to unfold. And right now, there's one set of people who have a vision for what the future is going to look like, which is, Sam Altman and Elon Musk and a few other people. And my view is like, um, we got to put another vision out there and work toward that if we don't want that to be the default.
You have a vision of like real human-to-human interactions. In fact, they're better because agents allow us to sort of simplify the process of setting up the ideal, group chats or community message boards. So give me a couple of things that could happen that would make this AI-driven future of communication better, and a couple of things that might happen that could make it worse.
Well, let me start with the worst. I think the worst is we get quickly locked into a handful of interface holders that have a particular set of economic incentives. Right now, I see Google as very well positioned to play this role. And in fact, a bunch of the stuff they rolled out at I/O is trying to play this role. And I think if you remember the browser wars, this is sort of like the super browser wars of the future, that everybody's going to try to own this interface. I think what we want is a lot of consumer choice and a lot of transparency about what the economic incentives are that are baked into these interfaces. The flip side is, one thing that I would look for is increased auditing and transparency of what are the incentive systems that are built into these interfaces, these agentic interfaces. Because I think we're going to start to see some pretty crazy stuff happen where people get free interfaces and software that's actually either trying to sell them something, trying to manipulate them, trying to pull them over to a political position. Like that's all going to start happening. And so one really critical thing is to create the right marketplace for the agentic interfaces. I think a second thing is, how do we build the exemplars of what's possible right now? Because I think in some ways, like the biggest problem is a failure of imagination. And I see this all the time because in our space, looking at these open protocols, you know, people have been doing a lot of work to kind of like reinvent the platforms of the 2010s. And it's sort of like, oh, this is 2010 Twitter, this is 2010 Facebook. But really, there are a lot of new things that are possible. And we need to kind of to connect that imagination and those design principles with platforms that meet people's needs.
So one of the things that worries you is that one or more of the big platforms, whether it's OpenAI or Gemini or Claude or whatever, becomes kind of like the locked-in default way that we communicate with everybody,
Yeah.
right? Or Meta, right, which is going to build its AI system into WhatsApp, which is already the default for the majority of my group chats. Why is that not close to inevitable? I mean, these companies have all the money in the world. They have huge incentives. Like your and my communication about what's going on in Fort Greene is hugely valuable to all of these companies. Why won't they just win this?
One question comes back to the economics, which is like, it's unclear where the most economic value is. And, it's like OpenAI was making a big play, moving even more in this kind of social media first
Yeah.
direction with Sora. But now they've corrected because they understand that actually the enterprise customer is where they need to be focused to
Oh, that's
win,
interesting. Right.
These are going to be agonizing and important decisions that people make about where they put their trust
Yeah.
with these platforms. And what I mean by that is, it's one thing to go on Facebook and say I like, you two, and therefore Facebook's inferring that I like some other band. It's another thing to give it access to all of my past email, all of my text messages, and it's going to ask for that, right? It's going to really want to know everything about us. And we're going to have to make some decisions about where that trust is warranted. And to me, that's a good thing in that it sets up a different kind of competitive ecosystem from the network effects based ecosystem that we've uh, lived in the social
Wait,
era.
meaning that the big companies are going to have to win by winning your trust, not by building sort of a network ecosystem where once one person joins, it makes it much easier for the second person to join.
I think there's more of an incentive to do that.
You've spent certainly the last 15 years where I've known you and I've followed your work, you've spent all of your time trying to make online communication, or much of your time, trying to make online communication better and healthier. Why is that so important to you?
I don't think you can have like a healthy society without um, people being able to speak to each other and understand each other. At the end of the day, like that's what we're talking about is can we have a conversation to figure out our common problems and our common opportunities? And like I grew up in a small town with a newspaper that did that, where you would see yourself in the newspaper, you would see other people, and you would kind of get a sense of what your community was about. And you would also write letters to the editor and exchange views about things, right? Very slow social media. And and now that newspaper is gone, and we're inventing the next set of technologies that'll either bring us together or not. And we have a lot of big problems to figure out together. And so to me, having the information ecosystem that helps us do that is critical to solving those problems.
Let's stay in your community then. So what town was this?
This is Camden, Maine. Yeah.
Camden, Maine. All right. So explain what Roundabout is, and then explain what happens when Roundabout comes to Camden, Maine. Camden's lovely, by the way. It's a nice place.
It is a good place. We're building this platform called Roundabout, and we're doing it kind of to demonstrate what's possible if you put community connection ahead of just driving kind of engagement metrics up. So it's built around one of the things that we noticed in our research was that every high functioning online community that we could find has a person or people who spend a lot of energy and a lot of time kind of making it good, holding people accountable, pulling the conversation in certain directions. We call them stewards. And so we've built Roundabout.
Reddit mods, Wikipedia editors, people who just keep these people who, in my group chats, there's usually like one person who's like, hey, everybody, or two people.
Yeah. No, and these are the people that basically when online, community works, and it does work sometimes.
Yeah.
It's because of these people.
Yeah.
But they're kind of like an afterthought to the platforms because they just have to keep them happy enough to not go away. But if you talk to the stewards, there are a lot of things that they have to do that are really difficult. And so we've tried to make it as easy as possible to be a steward. We've also tried to make it as easy as possible as a user to kind of understand what's happening in your community. What do I want to get involved in that's like an offline activity? Like I'm actually going to get off my phone and go do something with other people. What's the events calendar? Like how do we replace some of those functions that newspapers did, but in this kind of horizontal person to person way? But the core is that you're talking to your actual neighbors and you're talking to actual human beings. And we're doing a lot of work to make sure that, well, it's easier to steward. It's all still kind of people there.
And then, okay.
And
how do you get people in? So you get these stewards, they sign up.
Yeah.
And I remember this. I remember I was trying to build this alternative social media platform. You were being helpful with Speakeasy. And I remember we were like, okay, we're going to try to do an experiment in Goffstown, New Hampshire, where I used to live. We've got someone who lives there. And I sent emails to like 100 people. I posted in the Facebook groups. Nobody joined, right? Like it was just impossible to get people in because they're already in Facebook and like they didn't know me and we didn't have the right steward because he wasn't that connected to it all. How do you get people into these groups and caring? Like the startup costs are high.
So part of it is we're just providing information that's useful. So for example, there's an email newsletter that collates everything that's happening around about, brings it out to people. And because doesn't matter to us if people engage, in the app or outside of the app, like we can bring it out to people. We can bring it out to people on Instagram. We can kind of like start to bring some of the utility of this local information utility out to people wherever they are.
Yeah.
And then it becomes the place where people can bring their information when they have something to share. We're starting to see people really in these local places go like, oh, there's like a lot of little bits and pieces, but this is the place where everything's kind of getting collected and organized.
I remember something you told me once, which was that it's really good. I think there were two ideas that you gave to me that stuck with me while I was working on Speakeasy and Narwhal. One was if people can agree on something first, then they can talk about the things they disagree upon, right?
Hmm.
And the second was that you sometimes need to be able to give people like limited anonymity, right? Not full anonymity. Do you take these principles and put them in Roundabout?
The first one, absolutely, which is, the reason that we're focused in these like very local places is because people don't trust a lot in America right now,
Yeah.
but they do feel pretty good about their neighbors generally, and they trust them. And so this is like there's some shared identity
Yep.
that you just naturally can trade on when we're all members of this small community or neighborhood or whatever.
Yep.
It doesn't get you everywhere, but it gets you started. And we're really also trying to. One of the things that we find on Nextdoor and some of the other platforms is just that because of the engagement mechanics, the communities gravitate toward the like bad stuff that's happening. But when you look at like a local newspaper, a lot of what's happening, a lot of what you see is like, oh, the middle school team is going to the state championships or whatever. It's this positive local
Yeah.
news that makes you feel invested in other people, and we're trying to kind of build that up too. So that's one piece, which is like creating this sense of real local connection and identity. I think is really important, and to do that without, I mean, to go back to our town square conversation, it's like very rarely do you walk up to a random stranger in public and say like, I want to talk to you about abortion or whatever. Like that's not a normal,
Yeah.
behavior for most people. But that's kind of like the expectation online. And so we're trying to start with this much more like day-to-day living
Yep.
stuff and build up from there rather than start with the like controversial stuff. In terms of anonymity, pseudonymity, we're still playing with that, honestly. I think it is a good design principle. Um, I think there are opportunities to use it here, but we haven't like figured it out exactly in
All right. So
Roundabout.
the idea is that everybody's going to you're going to build this foundation where they're talking about the green market and they're excited about the little league team making it to the state championship. And that'll eventually lead to the harder conversations.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Anonymity, we can park that. How do you avoid falling into the Nextdoor trap? And let me bring back a previous experiment you ran,
Yeah.
which was Upworthy, right? So you
Yeah.
start this site, it's to build us, bring out positive news stories, find things around the web that people haven't noticed. And eventually it sort of degrades into engagement bait, right? Or at least that's my interpretation. Why don't you tell the Upworthy story and what you learned from it, what I've misunderstood about it, and how it applies to the Roundabout story?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. In Upworthy, we had a really particular kind of entry point, which was we're going to take civically useful, stories about good things that are happening and try to make them go viral, just like the other stuff. And it worked. It was amazing.
It was the fastest
Um,
growing website in history at one
that's
point.
that's right. And in our zeal to do that, we introduced a bunch of really annoying, headline tropes and other things that then got used by other people who didn't have that motive.
Right.
And for a brief moment, we're a big thing in the Facebook ecosystem. I don't regret spending a bunch of energy trying to figure out how you get more attention for the things that really matter.
Yeah.
I do think that it's always this balance of like, when do you rein it in and, not be over grabby of people's
Do you
attention
think
or
it's
time.
possible that if you had reined in Upworthy earlier and you had said, "Oh wait, there's something wrong with these headlines. Like you'll never believe what this puppy did on Wednesday,"
Yeah.
right? And if
It-
you had reined that in earlier, that the whole history would have been different.
the whole history of Upworthy.
Yeah, yeah. I
Um,
mean, also maybe the whole history of like the digital news, but let's just stick with Upworthy.
it's possible. I mean, the counterfactuals are hard to run. There are a couple differences with Upworthy and what we're doing now. So one is simply Upworthy was a venture backed company, and we had
Right.
to like
You needed outside
we had to
returns.
we had to show people that we were going to be the biggest internet. I remember having a conversation with a venture capitalist who was a good guy actually, who um who was like, I can see how this could be $1 billion company, but that doesn't matter to me. What I want to know is, can it be a $20 billion company? And we would kind of like have to, try to come up with the way that this was going to be a $20 billion company, which was not really what we were setting out to do.
Right.
And so to me, like that was part of the learning about how venture economics can kind of distort something, because it was never enough. It was never going to be enough. The point was growth, right? And there is something dangerous about getting focused on growth as the only metric.
So you feel like you fell into a venture trap. I remember once talking to a venture capitalist pitching my company called Narwhal, and he was like, "You're selling kale in a candy shop, Nick." I was like, "Yeah, I guess that's part of the problem."
But I do think, like, look, we have all these great things in society that are not built around permanent growth, right? Like, permanent growth is important if you're a publicly traded company. It's important if you're trying to like give investors outsized returns. But libraries don't have permanent growth. They just do a community service every day, and people appreciate them, and they're the most trusted institution in America. Schools, parks, like we do a lot of things that are structured in a different way around a public service mission rather than around a financial mission. And I think there's room for that in our online life as well. And I think that starts with filling a gap that the market isn't, right? And right now we can say for sure the market is not filling the gap of helping people connect to their local communities. Like, newspapers are receding, and nothing is like coming in that is filling this need that people have to know what's going on and to connect with the people around them. And so to me, this is like a really great place to try out this different model of how to do things.
All right, so let's say I gave you two choices, Eli. I said, Eli, choice number one, you're going to get, I don't know, $100 million from a foundation that's just a good guy foundation, no returns. You can do whatever you want. You're going to build out Roundabout. Option two is that either Elon or Mark Zuckerberg calls you, or Sam Altman or Dario, and they say, Eli, I want you on the inside, and I want you to build out community for us. I want you to help us serve this need that's no longer there now that the local newspaper in Camden has disappeared. Which of these has a bigger impact?
I mean, I'm gonna go with the $100 million one, because that's where my
100 million is
that's
probably too much.
that's
Let's say
like
15.
well, okay. I mean, I think the exciting thing with Roundabout is like there is a model here that works for communities to support their own local information infrastructure. We see this in public radio, for example, which is an infrastructure for doing local media that has worked pretty well, that billions of dollars every year that are member contributed. So the idea isn't that this has to be dependent on philanthropy, forever, or even from the start. I guess fundamentally, I don't know that the story so far, the story of having, worthy public aspirations inside of hyper growth companies that have borrowed, in this case, hundreds of billions of dollars, and whose investors are expecting trillions of dollars of profits. Like, I think the idea that this continues to be a priority inside those companies is a hard one,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And so it's not even a question of the sincerity of those people at the moment that they're making the offer. It's a question of, what happens in 3 years when all of a sudden, the stock isn't looking so great and there's a big restructuring. It's hard to keep these public spirited efforts alive inside of these kinds of organizations.
We'll be back in a minute with more from New Public's Eli Pariser.
AI, literally.
Exactly. And AI.
Got it?
Everyone has an opinion on AI, but are any of them right for your enterprise?
AI.
Cut through the AI noise with AI solutions from PwC, so you can solve the business problems that matter most. PwC.
I want to go to one of the ideas that you're most known for, which is filter bubbles, right? And you gave a very famous TED Talk, and you described and you named a phenomenon in the social web that, certainly helped the way everybody understood what was happening, even if it didn't reverse it. Are filter bubbles going to get worse with agents? Because I kind of think they are, because you'll be able to make your own reality.
This is filter bubbles on steroids, right, that we're headed into. And we're already seeing it a little bit with this is the less optimistic part of my my shtick here. But like, I think actually what we're seeing with sycophancy is just the beginning, and we're already seeing some evidence that actually that's affecting, for example, how what they're searching for. So when I say ChatGPT, tell me what's going on, ChatGPT has some idea, some model of who I am and what I'm interested in, and it's going to search websites that it thinks that I might be interested in more than
Right.
it might for you. So we're starting to kind of like ease into that. We're about to enter, the next generation of models that are much more have much more personal context about us, right? And B, are going to start to really learn in a deeper way. And I think this is like one of the inflection points in the development of AI that not enough people are paying attention to. Is like I think this world where we all are to some degree operating on like there's a thin layer of personalization on top of what is a very standardized model that essentially remembers nothing. That's going to start to shift. When I talk to the like LLM people, you know, there's this unsolved big question that I don't know if it's going to be solved in 1, 3, 5, 10 years, which is kind of back propagation. It's like, how do I actually change the model? Like with human
Yeah.
beings, our neurons rewire when we learn something.
Yeah.
The model doesn't rewire its weights each time that it learns something on my behalf. And at some point, we're going to cross that Rubicon, and we're going to end up in this world where your ChatGPT model is kind of starting to
Oh,
be
I see.
fundamentally
Right. So it's not just it's not just a thinly personalized ChatGPT, which is where we are now, or a
Right.
deeply personalized one, which will be once I give Codex access to all my emails. It will be even more than that. It will be like an
It will
entire brain based on this.
the brain will start to rewire, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like people are under attending to how significant of a phase shift that's going to be from the current kind of paradigm of how we're doing large language
There's a
models.
theory that AI will actually bring people to the center of conversations. And in fact, there's data that
Yeah.
suggests that, right? And that it's the opposite of social media. Do you think this is going to hold?
I would like to believe that it's going to hold, but I don't think so, right? I think it's kind of a vestige of this particular moment where, on the one hand, the models often don't have a lot of information about the people that they're serving. And on the other hand, the models are very standardized. And I think as both of those things change, that's going to be less the case. I would say that's also not inevitable. And this is another place where I just want to push back on kind of the sense that this is out of anyone's hands.
Right.
Like sycophancy itself is an artifact of engagement training. Like we know this for a fact. We saw it happen when ChatGPT rolled out one of its models, and it rolled out many different
Yeah.
variations. And you can turn it up and you can turn it down. It all happens in post training. It's the frosting on the cake, not the
Yep.
cake itself. And so, what are the incentives of these companies? Because I think, given a certain set of incentives, it's not hard to build an agent that really exposes people to opposing ideas. And in fact, there's some kind of like natural pull toward, if you're trained on the basis of all human knowledge, sharing a bunch of the different perspectives in that knowledge. Then there's this question of like, yeah, but which chatbots are getting the most engagement? And that's where I think the danger area comes in. But that's a set of choices we as the public, we as consumers could impact.
So what if I was a mod and I'm a mod on like a really good Reddit forum and I say, okay, now on before you post, you're going to have to run it through this particular custom AI that I've built. And that custom AI is going to look at whatever you post and it's going to challenge your assumptions and it's going to, be the smartest version. It's going to be kind, generous, thoughtful, but just pushing back on every sort of faulty assumption you have. Do you think people would want that?
So I was just looking at research from Javan Bavel, who's a researcher here at NYU,
Yep.
who has a great study on people do want and need some form of positive feedback when they say something.
Yeah, that's
if
true.
you-
I'm glad
if-
you said that, Eli.
Yeah, and you're doing a great job with the
Yeah.
interview.
Thank you.
But the form of positive feedback is actually something you can tweak. And so one way to do positive feedback is to say, you're so brilliant. Like, I can't believe how insightful you're being. Another way to do it is what the paper calls positive regard. And this is basically like I can see how hard you're working on this. You're doing a really great job like working through it. Let me share a couple of thoughts that aren't totally where you're going, but might be useful to push up against. And it turns out that kind of feedback is actually like equally good as the like, that's a brilliant idea. I can't believe you came up with that. So there are ways of doing positive feedback that don't.
Meaning people feel as good with the second kind as with the first kind, even though the second kind you're improving and changing their assumptions.
Yeah, and so it creates some space to push back, right? And so again, I think that's reason for hope from my standpoint, because there are multiple different ways to build these things, and they don't have to be these like, hyper bubbling, self-reinforcing. And as you say, they are very capable of actually like more capable than any technology we've ever probably had
Yeah.
at helping people hear other viewpoints. The question is whether the incentives encourage that.
Last question. I asked this of all my guests. If you had an unlimited budget, you could fund anything in AI. Where would you direct it?
I have a theory that we're spending a lot of time trying to exercise control within AI agents. Like, how do we make AI agents be good?
Yeah.
And that's sort of analogous to like building a human society where you spend all of your energy trying to like craft the perfect moral child and have them grow up moral,
Yeah.
and then send them into society with no institutions or rules and hope for the best.
Yeah.
And I think what we've learned about human societies is that actually controlling behavior has less to do with individual moral dilemmas and much more to do with the structures and the incentive structures that we put people into. And so, if I had an unlimited budget, I would be trying to figure out, sort of what are the institutions of an agentic AI world that from the outside of these agents, let's assume that not all agents are good. Let's assume that some are really bad. How do we create the right incentive structures, the AI social workers and AI police, if you will,
Yeah.
to ensure that this society that's quickly going to include not only 8 billion humans, but also probably like many billions or trillions of AI agents works out well?
Wait, this is an idea I haven't heard. So you would fund essentially like public service. Right now, the AI police are like Anthropic, built up its own systems, right? It has its constitution, same with
Right.
OpenAI, et cetera. You would actually have like AI supervisors on the open web, AI judiciary.
Yeah. No, I think you have to find a way to control behavior from the outside, not just the inside. And I think most of the AI world is really focused on controlling behavior from the inside.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to have Grok out there wilding out and doing crazy things. And the question is like, what can you do without controlling Grok
Yeah.
that creates a healthy ecosystem? And there are lots of ways that you can do that if that's your point of view. But there isn't a lot of investment in that kind of area. And so to me, that's like the big open
Right. So
question.
you fund a lot of money to like buy servers, get training data, set up nonprofits. Is this run by the UN? Who's going to run the sort of the world's agent police?
Well, I don't totally know. And I think that to some degree you can do this in particular places where you're making markets, right?
Yeah.
So agents are going to want to talk to each other and exchange information and exchange money. And when you're creating the structures that allow them to do that, that's an opportunity to start to like
Yeah.
figure out what's the role for, the police, the investigators, the
SEC.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But you can DDoS an agent if it's misbehaving. Like that's not a unsolvable problem. And so how do you start to create disincentives for agents to do bad things and incentives for agents to do good things?
That is a remarkable answer, Eli Pariser. Thank you so much for joining The Most Interesting Thing in AI.
Thank you for having me on.
That was my conversation with Eli Pariser. Something I still wonder about. If Eli is right, and human connection takes on a premium in a post-AI world, then won't we want some form of proof of humanity? It used to be that jumping on a webcam was enough, but that's obviously not the case. So what do you think? How are we going to actually verify who's real? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to this channel for more.